I never imagined that I would spend New Year's Eve alone at 78. For most of my life, that night had been loud, crowded, and predictable. Family dinners that stretched too long, forced laughter, the television playing countdowns no one really watched, and the quiet relief when everyone finally went home. I used to complain about the noise, the mess, the exhaustion, but that year, when the house went silent hours before midnight, I realized something uncomfortable. I hadn't been afraid of the noise. I had been afraid of the quiet. The decision hadn't happened suddenly. My children had called weeks earlier, explaining their plans with an ease that left no room for discussion. One had promised their in-laws, another had booked a short trip, and someone casually suggested we celebrate together another time. Their voices were kind, reasonable, and detached. I agreed too quickly, saying it was fine, that I didn't mind. I even meant it in the moment. Only later did the weight of that agreement settle in my chest. That evening, I cooked a small meal for myself, something simple and practical. I ate at the kitchen table instead of the dining room, leaving the larger space dark. The house felt bigger that way, emptier. Outside, distant fireworks popped and echoed, muffled by the cold air. I sat with my tea, telling myself this was what independence looked like, that needing no one was a strength. Still, I kept glancing at the clock, as if time itself might offer company. As midnight approached, memories surfaced without invitation. New Year's nights from decades ago, when my parents were still alive, when my children were small and excited, when the future felt wide and forgiving. Back then, I thought time moved slowly. Now it rushed past, leaving little proof that I had ever stood still long enough to notice it. I wondered how many moments I had postponed, how many conversations I had softened or delayed because I believed there would always be another chance. At 11:59, I stood alone in the living room. The television was off. I didn't want a manufactured countdown reminding me of what I lacked. When midnight arrived, it did so quietly. No cheers, no embraces, just the gentle ticking of the wall clock. I whispered a simple wish to myself, not for happiness or health, but for clarity. I wanted to understand what all these years had been for, what I was meant to carry forward, and what I was finally allowed to release. That was when the knock came. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just 3 firm taps on the front door. For a moment, I thought I imagined it. No one knocked on my door at midnight, especially not on New Year's Eve. I stood frozen, listening. Then it came again, unmistakable this time. My heart quickened, a strange mix of caution and curiosity. I grabbed my cardigan and walked toward the door, every step echoing louder than it should have. When I opened it, I didn't see what I expected. There was no family member, no lost neighbor from a party gone wrong. Instead, a young man stood there, holding a small paper bag, his breath visible in the cold air. He looked nervous, apologetic even. He explained that he lived a few houses down, that his grandmother had passed away recently, and that she used to insist on bringing food to neighbors on holidays. He said he hadn't wanted the tradition to end. For a moment I couldn't speak. I felt foolish for the assumptions I had made in those seconds before opening the door. I invited him inside, just long enough to escape the cold. We stood awkwardly in the entryway, exchanging names, exchanging fragments of our lives. He didn't stay long. He didn't need to. The warmth he brought with him lingered after he left, settling into the corners of the house like a quiet promise. I closed the door and leaned against it, the paper bag still warm in my hands. Inside was a simple loaf of bread and a handwritten note, wishing me peace in the coming year. I sat back at the kitchen table, unfolded the note, and laughed softly at the absurdity of it all. I had spent the entire evening convinced that being alone was a verdict on my life. Yet one unexpected knock had undone that belief in seconds. As I ate the bread, still warm, I felt something shift. Not happiness exactly, but openness. A realization that life was indeed finished presenting itself to me just because I had reached a certain age. I had been measuring my worth by who showed up when invited, by how often I was included in plans. I hadn't considered the quiet power of simply being present, available, and receptive to what might arrive unannounced. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual. I wrote in an old notebook I hadn't touched in years, recording the events not because they were dramatic but because they were honest. I admitted things to myself I had avoided for decades, that I had defined myself too narrowly, that I had accepted invisibility as a natural part of aging, that I had mistaken routine for purpose. The knock at the door didn't change my life because of who stood behind it. It changed my life because it interrupted the story I had been telling myself. The story that said I was waiting out my remaining years, quietly, politely, without expectation. That night, I understood that waiting was a choice, not a requirement. And for the first time in a long while, I considered what might happen if I chose differently. The days that followed felt subtly different, as if the world had shifted its angle toward me. Nothing dramatic happened at first. My routines remained the same. I woke early, made my tea, read the paper, and watched the light move slowly across the walls, yet beneath those familiar actions, something had loosened. The loneliness I had accepted as permanent now felt negotiable. Something I could examine rather than endure. I kept thinking about that knock. Not obsessively, but thoughtfully. The way one returns to a sentence in a book that feels important. Without fully understanding why, it wasn't the young man himself who lingered in my mind. It was the reminder that connection didn't always come from the places I expected. I had spent years waiting for invitations, phone calls, signs that I was still needed. I hadn't considered that sometimes the world responds when you quietly stay open instead of withdrawn. A few days into the new year, I decided to walk more, not for exercise but for observation. I took slower routes, paths I usually ignored. I noticed houses I had passed for years without seeing. I noticed people too, a woman struggling with grocery bags, a man repairing a fence in the cold, a child learning to ride a bike despite winter air. I began nodding, smiling, exchanging small words. These interactions were brief, almost insignificant, yet they stitched something together inside me. I realized how much of my later life I had spent shrinking, lowering my expectations, reducing my presence so as not to inconvenience anyone. I had confused independence with isolation, dignity with silence. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking, stopped offering, stopped believing my participation mattered. That New Year's night stripped those assumptions bare. It showed me that invisibility isn't imposed by age alone. It's often learned slowly through repeated disappointment. One afternoon, I baked bread, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. I remembered the warmth of the loaf from that night and wondered when I had last done something purely because it pleased me. The smell filled the house, lingering in the air long after the bread cooled. I wrapped a loaf and hesitated before doing something that would have felt unthinkable weeks earlier. I carried it to my neighbor's door and knocked. She looked surprised, then delighted. We talked longer than either of us planned to. She told me about her late husband, about the quiet evenings she struggled with, about the way time felt heavier after sunset. I listened without trying to fix anything. When I left, she hugged me, holding on a second longer than politeness required. Walking home, I understood that connection often begins with a simple offering, not a grand request. Calls from my children resumed in their usual rhythm, polite, brief, efficient. I noticed something different in myself during those conversations. I didn't rush to reassure them that I was fine. I didn't minimize my experiences or smooth over my feelings. When they asked how I was, I answered honestly. I told them I was learning. I told them I was changing. There were pauses on the line, moments of uncertainty. I didn't rush to fill those either. I began writing again every evening, filling pages with reflections I had postponed for years. I wrote about regrets, but also about relief, about the strange freedom that comes when you stop performing a role and start inhabiting your own life. I wrote about fear, not of death, but of disappearing before truly being seen. The act of naming these thoughts made them lighter, easier to carry. Midway through January, I ran into the young man again, this time at the corner store. He smiled, remembered my name, asked how I was doing. Our conversation was brief, ordinary, and yet it felt meaningful in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't about forming a friendship. It was about recognition, about the quiet acknowledgement that I existed, that my presence had weight. That night, I sat with my journal and reflected on the years I had spent waiting for permission. Permission to rest, to speak honestly, to take up space. I had assumed that those privileges faded with age, that relevance belonged to the young. The knock at my door had challenged that belief. It reminded me that relevance isn't granted. It's claimed through engagement, through curiosity, through the courage to remain available to life. I stopped dreading evenings. I stopped filling time with noise to avoid my thoughts. Silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like an invitation. I used it to think, to feel, to plan. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a narrowing corridor. It felt like an open room, modest in size perhaps, but filled with possibilities I had overlooked. I understood something important then. Being alone on New Year's at 78 wasn't a failure. It was a moment of clarity disguised as loss. It forced me to confront the stories I had been telling myself about my worth, my usefulness, my place in the world, and once those stories were exposed, they no longer held the same power. The unexpected knock didn't rescue me. It didn't solve anything. What it did was far more valuable. It reminded me that life still responds, that meaning doesn't vanish with age, that change doesn't require permission or youth, only willingness. And in that understanding, I felt a quiet determination settle in. I wasn't finished. I was just beginning a different chapter, one written with intention instead of resignation. As January faded into February, I noticed how my days had begun to feel connected rather than separate. Before, time had moved in isolated blocks, each day repeating the last without distinction. Now, there was a sense of continuation, as though I was slowly stitching meaning back into the fabric of my life. I woke each morning with a quiet curiosity, wondering not what I needed to get through but what I might notice, what might surprise me. That shift alone felt revolutionary. I began volunteering at the local library 2 afternoons a week. It wasn't something I had planned carefully. I saw a small notice taped near the entrance and decided, without overthinking, to ask. The work was simple, sometimes tedious, but it placed me among people again. Children asked for help finding books. Teenagers lingered awkwardly in the aisles. Older visitors exchanged knowing smiles. I wasn't there to be impressive. I was there to be present, and that proved to be enough. What struck me most was how easily people accepted my presence once I stopped apologizing for it. For years, I had prefaced conversations with self-deprecation, shrinking myself before anyone else could. Now, I spoke plainly. I listened attentively. I offered thoughts when they felt genuine. The response was subtle but undeniable. People leaned in, they stayed longer. They treated me not as a relic of the past, but as someone anchored firmly. In the present, even my home felt different. I rearranged furniture that had stayed in the same position for decades, as if afraid movement might disturb something fragile. I donated items I no longer needed, each one a quiet release of an old identity. The walls seemed to breathe easier afterward. So did I. It occurred to me that we often surround ourselves with objects that anchor us to versions of ourselves we have already outgrown. Letting go made space, not just physically, but emotionally. One evening, my daughter called unexpectedly. Her voice carried a hesitation I hadn't heard before. She asked how I had been spending my time. I told her about the walks, the library, the writing. There was a pause, then a laugh, light and surprised. She said she admired my energy. I didn't deflect the compliment. I accepted it quietly. In that moment, I realized that the way I saw myself was slowly teaching others how to see me too. I reflected often on the years I had spent equating usefulness with sacrifice. I had believed that love meant giving until nothing remained, that boundaries were selfish, that asking for more was ungrateful. Those beliefs had shaped my relationships and ultimately my sense of self. The knock on New Year's night hadn't erased that conditioning, but it had cracked it open. Through that crack, new possibilities kept slipping in. There were still moments of loneliness. I didn't pretend otherwise. Some evenings felt long, some mornings carried an ache I couldn't name, but loneliness no longer frightened me. It no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like weather, something that passed through rather than settled permanently. I learned to sit with it, to listen to what it was asking of me instead of trying to silence it. Often, it asked only for attention. I started hosting small gatherings, nothing elaborate. Tea, conversation, shared silence. A few neighbors, a fellow volunteer, the widow from down the street. We talked about ordinary things and profound ones, often in the same breath. I noticed how these chosen connections felt different from obligations. There was no history to perform, no roles to maintain. We met as we were, and that simplicity felt deeply nourishing. In my journal, patterns emerged. I wrote about fear of irrelevance, about the relief of letting go of expectations, about the quiet pride that came from choosing engagement over retreat. I saw clearly how close I had come to disappearing into routine, mistaking endurance for purpose. That realization didn't fill me with regret. It filled me with resolve. I still had time. And time, when used deliberately, was generous. The memory of that knock remained vivid, not because it was dramatic, but because it marked a boundary between two ways of living. Before it, I had been waiting. After it, I had begun participating. The difference was subtle, yet everything flowed from it. I no longer measured my days by who included me. I measured them by how fully I showed up. I understood now that aging didn't mean closing doors. It meant choosing which ones to open with intention. I had fewer illusions but more clarity. Fewer obligations but deeper commitments. The unexpected knock had reminded me that life doesn't announce its turning points with certainty. Sometimes it arrives quietly, asking only that you answer when it calls. As the year continued to unfold, I became more attentive to how differently I moved through the world. I no longer rushed conversations or avoided eye contact. I stood a little straighter, spoke a little slower, and allowed myself to occupy space, without apology. These changes weren't dramatic, but they were steady, and over time they reshaped how life met me halfway. People responded to certainty, even quiet certainty. I had spent years underestimating the power of simply knowing who I was. I thought often about how close I had come to closing myself off entirely. That New Year's night at 78 could have confirmed every fear I carried about aging and irrelevance. It would have been easy to retreat further, to accept solitude as my final companion. Instead, that single interruption forced me to reconsider what I believed about endings. I realized that moments don't define us unless we let them. Interpretation is where meaning truly lives. I stopped waiting for milestones to justify joy. I celebrated ordinary days. I cooked meals that took longer than necessary just because I enjoyed the process. I lingered over books instead of rushing. To finish them, I allowed conversations to wander without steering them toward conclusions. This unhurried way of living felt like reclaiming time that had always been mine but never fully used. My children noticed the difference more clearly. As months passed, visits felt less tense, less transactional. I didn't center my life around their schedules anymore, and oddly, that made our time together more genuine. They asked more questions. They listened longer. I understood then that dependence often breeds dismissal, while independence invites respect. By choosing myself, I hadn't pushed them away. I had invited a healthier distance, one that allowed connection without resentment. There were days when fear resurfaced, usually late at night. Questions about the future, about health, about how much time remained. But those thoughts no longer paralyzed me. I acknowledged them, then returned to the present. Worry had stolen enough from me already. I refused to let it claim what remained. Instead, I focused on what was within reach. Today's walk, tonight's meal, tomorrow's plan. I began mentoring a young volunteer at the library, someone unsure of their direction, burdened by the weight of expectation. I didn't offer advice unless asked. I listened. I shared small truths rather than grand lessons. Watching them grow more confident reminded me that influence doesn't require authority or youth. It requires presence and honesty. In helping them, I felt my own sense of purpose deepen. The unexpected knock on my door became a quiet symbol I carried with me. Not something I spoke about often, but something I returned to in moments of doubt. It reminded me that life can interrupt even our most settled assumptions. That opportunity doesn't always arrive wrapped in familiarity. Sometimes it comes as a gentle question, asking whether you're still willing to answer. I no longer feared being alone on holidays. Solitude had transformed from a threat into a resource. It gave me room to think, to feel, to choose. I understood now that being alone and being lonely are not the same. Loneliness is feeling unseen, and I had learned how to see myself clearly. That skill changed everything. As my 79th birthday approached, I reflected on how much had shifted in a single year, not because circumstances had dramatically improved, but because my relationship with life had. I stopped waiting for validation and started creating meaning. I stopped measuring myself by the past and began investing in the present. That change made time feel expansive instead of scarce. Looking back, I see that New Year's night as a hinge in my life. Before it, I lived cautiously, quietly stepping aside. After it, I chose engagement over retreat. I learned that age doesn't disqualify us from transformation. It sharpens it. It strips away illusion and leaves behind what truly matters. Choice, connection, and courage. I spent New Year alone at 78, but I was never abandoned. I was redirected. The unexpected knock didn't save me. It reminded me that I could still answer the door. And as long as I can do that, as long as I remain willing to meet life where it stands, I know my story is still being written, one deliberate moment at a time.